It's my pleasure to introduce Sean Andrist from Microsoft Research. Actually, Microsoft AI and Research with the new name. We were just discussing one. So Sean was recently graduated from University of Wisconsin, the other UW. From Bill Gimmelfu's lab, he was one of Bill's star students. He did a lot of work on designing interactive behaviors for embodied robots, especially focused on gaze, and I think some work on pointing. I had sent a link to his webpage. I don't know if you saw his 3-minute pitch, which was the award winner of the pitch competition, but this is going to be the 45-minute version of that 3-minute pitch. So because he recently defended his thesis, his talk is very fresh and polished, so I'm looking forward.
Thanks, Maya. Thanks for the intro. Yeah, the 3-minute pitch, I always feel bad that I won that because I feel like it's unfair when I have robots and everyone else was talking about like an individual protein or something, and it's like I got to show pictures of robots, so it was kind of unfair. Okay, so thanks for having me. Today, like Maya said, I'm going to talk mostly about some of my recently completed dissertation research at UW-Madison on how embodied agents, including both animated virtual agents and the physical social robots, can achieve positive interaction outcomes through the use of situated gaze mechanisms. And so by situated, I mean that these gaze mechanisms are anchored in the real world, where the agent is deployed and reactive to the social cues of the human user. So these are some of the agents and robots that you're going to see more of throughout this talk. In my PhD, I became extremely interested in embodied agents like these because they can collaborate, they can motivate, rehabilitate, educate, and to do so effectively, they use their bodies, their head, their eyes, their arms to produce the social cues that are an integral part of everyday human interaction. And so these days, there are tons and tons of embodied agent platforms out there, both as research platforms and starting to emerge more as consumer products. So on the virtual side, we have virtual agents for therapy, training simulations for the Army, practicing job interviews for people with developmental disabilities, healthcare agents to improve healthcare literacy, virtual buddies for child autism therapy, and many more. On the physical side of the fence, we're seeing robots as shopping assistants, robot autism therapy aides, robot health coaches, robot collaborators, robot thespians, robot receptionists, robots for everything. And increasingly, we're even seeing platforms that seem to be kind of a mix of both virtual and physical, often combining a physical robot body with an animated face. So combining the physical presence and manipulation abilities of a physical robot with the emotional expressivity and flexibility of an animated face. So there are lots and lots of robots and agents out there. And I've become extremely interested in the question of how we can design engaging and interesting and rewarding interactions with these agents. So consider just the huge space of possible social cues that we might consider on a humanoid robot like the Now that we have here. It's gaze, it's speech, it's pointing gestures, head gestures, it's posture, it's orientation, it's proxemics, meaning how close it's standing to you. So how should the robot kind of utilize all of these cues to target some specific outcomes in the interaction? How should the cues be situated in the environment it's embedded in and contingent on the behaviors of its human user or users? So for my dissertation, I largely focused on gaze cues, which are some of the most important for smooth social interaction. These are some of the things gaze is used for in human-human interaction. Gaze is used to regulate conversational flow. So you often pass the turn by looking at your conversational partner, and you claim the floor by looking away from them. Gaze is used to communicate what's going on inside your brain. Maybe you look away to show that you're thinking about something, or you look down at your shoes to show that you're uncomfortable. Gaze is important in relationships to build rapport and affiliation. It's important in education for improving the comprehension of students, and so on and so on. So now I'm not the only person to think about gaze for agents and robots. So I just want to show you a short clip from a TED Talk in which Rodney Brooks was presenting the Baxter robot for the first time. And I thought it was interesting, he kind of made a quick mention about why they bothered to put eyes on this thing.
The object off the conveyor, it's going to come bring it over here and put it down, and then it'll go back, reach for another object. The interesting thing is Baxter has some basic common sense. By the way, what's going on with the eyes? The eyes are on the screen there. The eyes look ahead where the robot's going to move, so a person that's interacting with the robot understands where it's going to reach and isn't surprised by its motions.
Right, so that's all well and good. We can put eyes on the robot, and maybe it can look where it's going, and that'll make it more interpretable and more usable. But once you start to dive into it, you start to run into some interesting questions. So imagine just the simple problem of having an agent or robot look at some point in space. So we might have a number of questions that immediately arise, such as if it has articulated eyes, does it look only with its eyes? Does its head move as well? When should it look there? Why is it looking there? Where should it look next? How should its gaze act sort of contingently on the behaviors of what the human is doing in relation to the environment that the agent is in? And again, so this is what I mean by the agent's gaze mechanisms being situated, and it's that overarching idea that I have used to structure my explorations of agent gaze. So my overall research question is this: how can we design and implement situated gaze mechanisms that enable embodied agents to more effectively interact with people? And so by effectiveness here, I'm referring to some positive outcomes like learning, rapport, motivation, naturalness, efficiency, and I try to look across some different contexts, from basic conversation to education, rehabilitation, and collaboration. So today I'm going to talk about 3 projects that I did. The first kind of tackles the question of when to gaze. So by default, when talking to a robot, it's probably just going to stare at you, especially if there's nothing else to look at. So we need a model to tell them when to look away, or when to avert their gaze. Then I'll talk about a project where I explored how an agent can coordinate its gaze with the real-time gaze behavior of the user in a physical collaboration. And finally, I'll discuss how a robot can use its gaze to match the extroversion or introversion of the user, and how that matching can be effective for motivation. And so in each of my projects, I follow a 3-stage iterative process of understanding, building, and evaluating. So first, I want to understand a certain gaze mechanism as it occurs in human-human interaction, both through existing literature and by actually bringing people into the lab and collecting new data. Next, I work to synthesize and build those gaze mechanisms into models for both virtual agents and robots. And most of what I'll show you today are sort of stochastic models with some heuristics baked in, where the stochastic parameters are derived from data collection, and the heuristics are often injected as knowledge from previous work in places like the social sciences. And finally, I evaluate the effectiveness of these gaze mechanisms in creating positive outcomes by recruiting participants to actually come in and interact with those agents. And so I just want to emphasize that I really take kind of a human-centered approach here, with a lot of focus on the understanding phase. I try to develop models and mechanisms that are deeply rooted in the existing theory, and then supplement that with observations from people we bring into the lab, because oftentimes the social science theories will get us started, but they're not precise enough to actually go and implement it on the robot. So early on, I was interested in this when question. Specifically, when should the agent avert its gaze in conversation? So as you know, when we talk to each other, we don't just stare at each other, stare in each other's eyes 100% of the time. That would be extremely creepy. But that's kind of what robots do by default, especially if they have some simple face tracking built in, they're just going to lock onto you. So first, we brought some pairs of people into the lab, and we asked them to have some informal conversations with each other. So we had 24 dyads of people. We did gender balancing, and they were basically just asking each other about their movie preferences. And so then we had a pair of annotators code every instance in the data where participants looked away and identified why they were doing so. Because existing literature had identified 3 primary functions of gaze aversion, which we coded in that data. So first of all, gaze aversions can disengage your attention from the face of your partner to help when you're thinking or remembering something. And by doing that, you're actually signaling to the other person that some cognitive processing is occurring. and so perhaps you're putting some more thought into what you're about to say. Second, gaze aversions can regulate the conversational floor. So by looking away at the beginning of an utterance, you're more solidly claiming the conversational floor. And then similarly, when you look away during pauses in your speech, you're indicating that you're kind of holding on to that conversational turn and that you shouldn't be interrupted. And finally, gaze aversions can modulate the intimacy level of the conversation, and these simply make the other person more comfortable by not being stared at. So from the data, we obtained some timing statistics for different kinds of gaze aversions, like their frequency, their average length, and when they occurred to different events on the speech stream. So for example, cognitive gaze aversions in relation to the start of the response to a question. We found people looking away a little over a second before the start of their answer, kept looking away for a little over 2 more seconds, and then looked back to their partner on average.
Is it easy to annotate these and distinguish them when people watch the videos or so?
So I mean, it's easy to. I mean, it's easy. So we had 2 annotators, and we wanted to make sure that there was a high amount of overlap. And I forget what the kappas were here. But it was pretty easy. I mean, there's some kind of subtlety in terms of getting the timings right, like, because people look with just their eyes or kind of do like a more big one. And kind of distinguishing between some of the cognitive and like the floor management ones because sometimes they can serve 2 purposes. So we kind of had people go in waves of like, okay, first find all the ones where it's obvious that they were thinking about something for those, and then do the ones that are more for turn taking, and then do the rest we kind of assume are more of the intimacy ones. But there is definitely a little bit of ambiguity there.
Did you compute an inter-rater reliability between your scores?
Yeah. So I don't remember what the actual reliability was, but we had pretty high numbers for that. And for any disagreements, we brought the coders together and had to kind of come to an agreement on it and figure out why and so the most confusion was usually between these cognitive one and the floor management ones, predominantly because sometimes it can serve 2 purposes. But for the purpose of our modeling, we tried to just stick it to one or the other. So then for the intimacy modulating ones, we kind of modeled them as the average length between and the average length of them, and we distinguished between times speaking and times listening because those are 2. We found those to be very different distributions. And then for the floor management ones, we were looking, for example, a lot at these pauses to see, if people have 2 things they want to say, when do they look away during the pause to hold on to that conversational floor. And so we modeled all of these parameters as Gaussian distributions with means and standard deviations that we can then draw from when actually executing gaze aversions on the agent system. And so that was kind of the timing. We also looked at the direction. So up, down, or to the side, where are you averting your gaze? For the downward direction, we found a fairly equal split among the functions. We found that the intimacy regulating and floor managing gaze aversions were more likely to be directed to the side. And we found that the cognitive gaze aversions were more likely to be directed upwards. And so again, we had these kind of spatial distributions that we again draw from for actually executing those aversions on the robots and agents. So from that analysis, we built this model, allowing an agent like this to use gaze aversions in conversation. So here I'm going to show you a quick video example where the virtual agent was just asked a question in a sort of mock job interview. And it employs a cognitive gaze aversion at the beginning of its response, and then a couple of intimacy gaze aversions during it.
I'm a people person. I really enjoy meeting and working with a lot of different people. I also enjoy solving problems, troubleshooting issues, and coming up with solutions in a timely manner.
Right, and so that was kind of the virtual agent side, which we started with because, and I did this a lot in my work, where the virtual agents were kind of easier to start with. They have a lot more programmability and flexibility, and you can do subtle things with the eyes. But I also wanted to do this with robots, so we implemented them on the Now robot platform you see here. There were a number of challenges there. So first of all, it does not have articulated eyes, so we kind of had to have head motion be a bit more pronounced to replace the eyes plus head motion that you could see in the virtual agent in the previous video. The head is also recruited for face tracking, and we found it very important to add some random idle motion to make it sort of less static and a little bit more lifelike. So we used a technique from computer graphics called Perlin noise here, which kind of adds some subtle structured biological looking motion when it's not making a pronounced gaze aversion, for example, just to make it seem a little more alive. And so then we have all these different kinds of head motions that we are continuously combining and smoothing into a single target head rotation at every time step. Yeah. No,
so for the aversion, it seems like, is it one type of aversion? Like you could look a little bit down, or you could look more to the side up, or things like that. Is it just one angle you have, kind of, or?
Yeah. So we kind of kept it in the kind of either up, down, or to the side ones. We didn't have it a completely continuous.
But was it random between those then? Or
so we tried to replicate the distributions that we saw from
from
the people. So there was picking probabilistically. You know, if it needed to do a cognitive gaze aversion, it was more likely to be to upwards because that's what we saw, but not completely prescribed. Yeah.
And is it like all the way upwards, or there is a scale like where kind of like?
So that was when we were actually designing it. We tried to make it add a little bit of randomness to that, so it wasn't always the same amount. And we we did a lot of iteration on just doing aversions that seemed, you know, big enough to be aversions, but not so huge that it looked like it was looking at something on the ceiling. But that kind of just took some manual tweaking on this specific platform.
The virtual agent thing, when it was trying to look up, maybe I didn't get it right, but it was almost felt like that the eyes were like just going in somewhere.
Yeah.
And it was not focusing on like maybe just a little bit above, or it's like all the way up.
Right, right. Yeah, and that was and there was a whole other project there on kind of trying to coordinate the eye motion with the head motion. And so that we were trying to tweak as well. But so we carried out 2 evaluations for this, one for the virtual agents and then one for the robots. In each evaluation, we used the same 4 conversational tasks. I'm not going to take the time to explain every one here, but they all included elements of asking the agent questions and responding to questions from the agent, followed by some subjective questionnaires about the experience. And so we compared 3 different conditions here between participants. So in the well-timed condition here, that just means the agent is using the model with the timings presented earlier from the data collection. There was a no gaze aversion condition where the agent did just kind of stare at you. And then we wanted to test sort of a badly timed condition where the agent would produce the same number of gaze aversions, but with completely random timings. So not actually sampling from what we had seen from the data to see that. So we wanted to see that not only do gaze aversions help, but it actually matters that you time them correctly. And so overall, we found good results in both evaluations. So here are just a couple of the results overall. So in terms of how thoughtful participants judged the robot to be about its responses, their ratings were higher when it was using those gaze aversions with the appropriate timings. And then more objectively, there was one task where the robot would often have 2 parts to what it wanted to say, separated by a long pause. And so we found that when it was using the gaze aversion appropriately during that pause, participants gave it much longer before interrupting it and kind of jumping in with what they wanted to say. Yes?
So how did the robot decide when it was its turn, or
so that was,
it was in the conversation with the person? Was it?
Yeah, so we didn't have a complicated turn-taking model for this project. We had kind of more of a question and response thing. So it was always the participants in this case had a specific set of questions they could ask. And so they could ask them in any order, but the robot would just latch onto those specific questions. So it wasn't
scripted in the answers.
It had some scripted responses to those, correct? Yeah, yeah. And then, so it was the same answers across all conditions. We were just changing how it used its gaze throughout them. Or it would sometimes have some scripted questions to ask the person, and it would just kind of actively listen, but it wasn't had to do anything with the content. Okay, so that was the gaze aversion project. In the next project, we were investigating how an agent should gaze and act in coordination with the human's gaze when collaborating over a shared physical task. So now it's not just a conversation, but there's actually some objects that could be the target of your gaze. So for the understanding phase here, we created a sandwich building task in which one person instructs the other on which items they would like on a sandwich. So it's a pretty simple task. But like most real-world tasks, it does have some potential ambiguities in the form of different ingredients that might look pretty similar, like having lettuce and spinach, different kinds of cheese, and so on. So we anticipated that gaze here would be an important resource for disambiguating the different instructions. And so for this understanding data collection phase, we had pairs of participants interact, both wearing synchronized head-mounted eye trackers. And so after observing many of these interactions, we did some task analysis and broke things down into some manageable chunks that we could get a handle on. So the fundamental unit of analysis we use here is what we call a reference action sequence, in which one person is making a verbal reference to some object that the other person is supposed to act upon in some way. So this is common in physical collaborative tasks. I'm saying pick up that block, or turn that screw, or hand me that cup, etc. And then we broke each of these sequences down into different phases. So the preparation to say the next reference, saying the reference itself, then the instructor monitoring the worker for understanding, and this might include a subsequence where the worker explicitly asks for more information, or maybe implicitly through its gaze or lack of action. And then there's the action itself, and then the instructor might give some feedback, and the sequence begins anew. So just to give you a sense for what that looked like in the data collection phase, here's just a bit of collected data from the instructor's point of view from their gaze camera.
I like the leaf of lettuce with the stuff on it, the leaf thingies. Yeah. And I would like the onions with a hole in the middle. And then I would like the pickles with the white. Okay.
Right. And then obviously we had very similar data from the worker's point of view that we could then annotate and analyze. So the next thing we did was to start plotting sequences of gaze fixations throughout these full kind of reference action sequences like the one you just saw. First of all, just looking for some general patterns and insights. So here, for example, the instructor is looking at the cheese, and then the other person's face, then to the bread, and so on. And so one of the first things we did was to try and calculate the amount of overlapping gaze between the two participants at various offsets in each phase. So if we were actually to shift those gaze plots back and forth for each participant, how much shared gaze to the same targets are we seeing? So in early phases, before or during the time when the instructor produces these verbal references, like to the cheese or whatever, we see peak alignment when the instructor's gaze is shifted ahead of the worker's gaze. So this is kind of indicating that the instructor's gaze is leading the worker's gaze at those points. And that kind of makes intuitive sense because the instructor is driving the interaction at those points when the worker doesn't know exactly what to look at yet. And then compare that to later, when the instructor is monitoring the worker's action to see if they understand and to see if they're doing the right action, where peak alignment happens when the worker's gaze is shifted ahead of the instructor's gaze stream. So the worker's gaze is in some sense kind of driving the instructor's gaze here. So our goal here was to replace the instructor side of the collaboration with the artificial agent. So to model this, we decided to break it down into two parts. What should the agent gaze at sort of independently of what the worker is gazing toward? But then for these more responsive phases, when it's supposed to be monitoring or seeing what the action is that the worker is doing, what should it gaze at in response to what the worker is gazing at? And so for the former, these kind of statistical parameters of independent gazing, we looked again at average fixation lengths and probabilities of shifting from one location to another. And the numbers here don't particularly matter, but you can notice, for example, long fixations to the referent object as opposed to other objects or objects that are potentially ambiguous. Some long gazes to the partner while monitoring their understanding. Gazes to the bread later in the sequence, which is the destination of the action. They had to put the ingredient on the bread. And then these parameters were implemented as essentially a semi-Markov chain, essentially a finite state machine where states are denoting what the gaze targets are to look at with probabilistic transitions and stochastic timings for how long to stay in each state before deciding which state to go to next, or how long to gaze at each gaze target before to gaze at the next target. And then to get a handle on the responsive part, we started looking at things in terms of potentially interesting events. So on the left, you're seeing a chart of the likelihood over all collected data of what the instructor is looking at over time, following the discrete event of the worker gazing at the wrong thing, looking at the wrong ambiguous item. So maybe they looked at this lettuce instead of the spinach. So we see that the likelihood of the instructor sort of driving gaze toward the correct referent goes up, and their likelihood of gazing towards other ingredients goes down, likely as a means of kind of driving joint attention to the correct object. And then similarly on the right, when the worker does look at the correct referent, again, the likelihood of looking also at the correct referent goes up over the next second. So these insights led us to designing some heuristic rules into the model to accomplish some particular goals that we know about from social science. So for joint attention following, if the user is gazing toward the referent, the agent should also follow their joint attention by looking at that referent. If the user is gazing towards something wrong and ambiguous, the agent should gaze toward the right thing to sort of shift the joint attention. And if the user doesn't fixate on the referent soon enough, then the agent will interpret that as some confusion and go ahead and give a full explicit verbal clarification. And then for mutual gaze, if the user actually gazes up at the agent should gaze responsibly back. And if they look at the agent without making any action, again, it can interpret that as confusion and provide some clarification. So here's an example of the second rule, the sort of driving joint attention, twice in a row. This is from one of our evaluations, which I'll talk about a little more. Here the participant is supposed to grab a pickle, but keeps looking at different cucumbers, and the agent is detecting that and responding to it.
Nice. Now let's add the pickle. It's the darker green pickle to my left. I mean, the darker green pickle to my left.
Right, so it's seeing that he's kind of looking at the wrong things. It's not actually tracking his arms or anything. It's just seeing where he's looking and when he's looking at the wrong things. Here's an example of the mutual gaze rule. Here the agent is asking for lettuce, and the participant gazes toward the agent before making an action, and the agent interprets this as a request for more info.
And now for the lettuce, please. It's the dark green lettuce in front of me.
So we recruited 32 participants to our lab to develop their skills as sandwich artists and make some fake sandwiches with a virtual agent. We tested 4 conditions, every combination of either producing gaze or not producing any gaze, and detecting and responding to gaze or not detecting gaze at all, every combination of those. And so we had them complete a different sandwich for each condition, each having 12 different ingredients to grab. So here's just a different angle on what that looked like. Here you'll see 3 ingredient requests here. In the first one, the agent asks for lettuce, and even though there are kind of 2 possibilities on the table, its gaze drives the user to the correct one. In the second one, the user verbally asks for clarification, and in the third one, the agent detects the need for clarification automatically from his gaze.
This sandwich is called the turkey special. First, let's put on the lettuce. And then, some mustard, please.
Is this the mustard?
It's the yellow blob in the middle. Now put the turkey on it. I mean, the white oval to my right.
He got confused.
Great.
It wasn't perfect, of course. So in our analysis, we found some promising results. We found that both producing these referential gaze cues and detecting user gaze made a significant impact on the time to complete each sandwich. So that's what you're seeing on the left is the time measure. It was about a 10 to 15 second improvement across the entire sandwich. And then looking at the number of errors, which would be grabbing the wrong ingredient, Again, when it produced gaze and when it detected gaze, that had a significant impact on the number of errors people made in the interaction. We also collected subjective measures in questionnaires at the end of the study. So we found that producing gaze improved users' perceptions of the agent's competence in the task, as well as its overall expressiveness. And when the agent was responding to user gaze, they rated the agent higher in terms of its cognitive abilities. But of course, we didn't tell them when it was responding and when it wasn't. They kind of made that assessment on their own. So we followed up that implementation in a couple of different ways. First, we wanted to explore whether this precise and potentially very expensive eye tracking was really essential, or could we achieve some of these same effects with some cheaper head tracking? So our approach was basically to relax the model a little bit. So for example, gazing at a referent is not defined by the gaze point being directly on that referent, but instead when the head pose is within a certain threshold of the referent, and otherwise everything about the model was the same. And so we designed a second study with 3 conditions this time. We were interested in comparing having full eye tracking with the eye tracker versus having head tracking versus having no tracking at all. And this time the agent produced gaze in all conditions because we were fairly convinced that producing gaze was better than not producing gaze. And so just quickly I'll go through the results here. We found, thankfully, the primary objective measures were still supported in this case in terms of the timing and the number of errors being comparable when moving from eye tracking to the less precise head tracking. And what we were kind of trying to drive for here was an exciting application in virtual reality, where we believe interactive virtual characters can create some compelling and immersive experiences if they're kind of gazing responsively to what you're looking at. So the last study confirmed that head pose can be a sufficient proxy for gaze, which is good because most VR systems include head tracking, but very few have any inbuilt eye tracking. So we wanted to see, does this system work in VR, essentially. So we had a third study where participants interacted with our agent in VR wearing the Oculus headset. Actions in this scenario were performed by gazing toward an ingredient and tapping on the space bar, but everything else about the interaction was identical to the previous studies. And once again, the agent produced gaze in both conditions, and we compared when the agent was being responsive in its gaze or not. So here's a user trying out the system just to give you sort of a sense for what this looked like in VR. His viewpoint is being rendered on the monitor in front of him.
To start, please grab the bacon and add it to the sandwich.
Which bacon?
It's the strip of bacon to your right. Great. Next, let's add some mustard. I mean, the yellow blob in the middle. Okay, and now, the egg, please.
So for this evaluation, this time we did not observe significant effect in terms of task completion time, but we did see fewer errors when the agent was gazing responsively. We also saw higher ratings of the agent's coordination abilities. We also looked at a few more behavioral things. So we found that participants actually made more mutual gaze with the agent when it was gazing responsively, and there was a higher percentage of shared gaze to objects when the agent was gazing responsively. So sort of indicating a higher degree of synchrony with the agent's behaviors. Okay, so for the last project I want to show you today, we were interested in exploring the relationship between gaze, personality, and motivation. So our goal here was to see how a robot can express a personality through its gaze motions that might match a user's personality, and how that matching of personality might improve a user's motivation, motivation to engage in a therapeutic task in more of a rehabilitation context. So this would be very useful for socially assistive robots, which are meant to help people go through things like stroke therapy, where the person might be continually motivated to do some repetitive physical motions. So like if they need to regain strength in an affected limb, they kind of need to do this simple thing over and over and over again, but it might get boring and they need to be motivated. So again, we conducted a data collection exercise to understand kind of how people use gaze and how that interacts with their personality and their desire to motivate. So in this task, one participant was assigned to be an instructor and the other was the worker. Their task was to collaboratively solve the Towers of Hanoi puzzle. The instructor explained all the rules and was responsible for motivating the worker to keep solving more and more puzzles. And the worker was responsible for carrying out the physical motions, and they could end the interaction whenever they wished. And we equally assigned roles to extroverted and introverted participants, which was assessed on a personality pretest, and we annotated all instructor gazes to the person and to the task space. So for modeling, we broke the task down into these two repeating phases. There's the in-task phase, where the actual task is being executed, and the between-task phase, when the instructor is motivating the worker to not give up and keep working on more puzzles. So here's a breakdown of what we found for the gazes of the instructor. So you're seeing the instructor's view of the worker and the task space. And these are average fixation lengths in seconds to the worker and to the puzzle in the two phases, in task and between task, split between extroverted and introverted instructors. So what we found was fairly intuitive. Extroverts are making more interpersonal gaze, and introverts are making more task gaze. And then we found that in the between task phase, in general, there's much more gaze to the person, which makes sense because that's the time when you're trying to provide encouragement and keep them going. While in the in-task phase, it's a lot more gaze to the task because you're monitoring their execution of it. So for this project, we implemented the Mecha robot platform to take on that instructor role. We developed some sensing and behavior components in the overall system that are linked together using ROS, which is an open source robot operating system. So on the sensing side, the robot can track the user's face in order to establish this mutual gaze when it needs to. It can track the user's speech to detect when they need help and when they want to terminate the interaction. And it can track the state to figure out when the puzzle is complete, or it can actually provide some automatic help if it detects a lot of wrong moves in a row. So these inputs are linked to behavioral controllers that then generate the appropriate gaze, speech, and gestures for the robot to actually carry out this interaction in the task. So from that collected data, we generated these two gaze profiles for an instructor robot to use. One which was supposed to be, or one which was modeled after the extroverts and is supposed to convey extroversion. The other modeled after the introverts. So this is a video I'm going to show of just the two models side by side. You'll notice that the robot on the left is spending much more time gazing at the user who's just off screen, and the robot on the right is spending much more time gazing to the puzzle. So I should say we did validate these behaviors in a kind of a quick online mechanical Turk study. We showed unlabeled videos like these to people and had them just assess the perceived extroversion or introversion of the robot and confirm that the extroverted robot really appeared more extroverted than the introverted robot. And so here's a quick video of what the interaction actually looked like. And I believe the robot here is in the extroverted mode.
Okay, I will ask you to solve this puzzle several times in different configurations. We will gradually increase the level of difficulty by adding more discs. Let's begin. Please move the tower from where it is to this peg here. Your new goal is the middle peg. Well done. Good. Well done. You completed the puzzle.
So we carried out an evaluation here in which participants collaborated on the Tower of Hanoi puzzle with the robot. participants were the workers and were clearly instructed that it was their decision to end whenever they wished to terminate the interaction. They could solve as many puzzles as they wished. And the robot gave all the instructions and motivation to keep solving these puzzles. So the evaluation followed a 2x2 design. The robot personality crossed with participant personality, where their personality was determined in a pretest on the Big Five personality inventory. And we recruited 40 participants for this study. So in general, we found a positive effect from this personality matching. So on the left is the measure of total time spent solving puzzles. We observed that extroverted participants worked longer with the extroverted robot, and the same thing for introverted participants working with the introverted robot. And on the right, you're seeing the subjective ratings of the robot's perceived performance as an instructor. So the difference between extroverted participants was not significant, but the difference between introverted participants was. We also asked participants to fill out a questionnaire about their intrinsic motivation to solve the puzzles going into the experiment. So participants with low intrinsic motivation to solve the puzzles, which is seen on the left, were significantly more affected by the robot's personality condition than participants that were highly intrinsically motivated to solve the puzzles, which you can see on the right, the effect is much less. So if going into it, you just love solving these puzzles, the robot's behaviors might not matter as much, but if you don't have a lot of motivation, doing this technique of maybe expressing the appropriate gaze and matching your personality can turn out to be more effective and sort of extrinsically motivating you. Right, so those are the three projects. Just to summarize, you've seen that I take a very human-centered approach to researching how embodied agents, both virtual and physical, can successfully use gaze in interactions. The methodology I follow involves obtaining a deep understanding of these fundamental mechanisms of human interaction, developing some computational models reflecting those mechanisms for agents, and then empirically evaluating how agents might utilize those models and measuring the resulting social and behavioral and cognitive impacts. So I talked about some projects on gaze aversion, gaze coordination, and adapting gaze to personality, and showed how we can achieve some pretty nice outcomes when the agents and robots have access to these mechanisms. So this work was done in collaboration with a lot of different people, particularly my advisors at University of Wisconsin, Bilge Mutlu and Mike Gleischer, as well as a whole host of colleagues and lab mates over the years. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Yeah.
So during gaze tracking aversion anything, one important factor is probably where I'm looking. Another important factor also is how fast I switch my gaze. If I'm looking at the screen from here to here is like a fraction of a second if I switch my attention. So most of the movies look like all the robots are like doing like very slow movement over there, so it felt like kind of drunk behavior.
Right.
So is that accounted for? Is that actually like you pay attention to those, or is that because of the hardware limitations? What is it?
For the robot, it was mostly a hardware limitation. I mean, the mecha robot there at the end, I mean, I was trying to get it to move as fast as I could, and that was about as fast as it could do. We spent a lot of time on this early on, because I started more in the virtual agent side, and there you have 100% control over velocities. And so I was really trying to nail the velocity profile, and I was reading a lot of like neurophysiology literature on like, you know, what are the actual velocity profiles of eyes in the head, and how fast does the head move in relation to the eyes. And so there were some early projects I didn't talk about here on kind of just looking at the virtual agent and exploring those different speeds. And then I tried to replicate that as much as I could when going to the physical platforms. With the now, it's just moving its head, so it's kind of, I tried to at least do some ease in and ease out that you see in, you know, biological motion. But for the mecha, yeah, it was just kind of the hardware limitations of it. But it's important to you know, have as a design component.
For the eye movement, there's this tracking and there's like saccades. You jump from one place to the other. Are you accounting for any of those, or this is...
Right. So again, in the virtual agent stuff, there was a whole separate model underlying for saccadic motion. So, there's a different kind of motion when you're looking from one target to another. That's kind of a gaze shift, we called. But then underlying that, you're constantly making these little saccadic movements that are very fast. And there was previous work in computer graphics and animation. There was a paper called Eyes Alive that kind of had a nice model for doing these random saccadic motions. Well, structurally random that kind of replicates how people do it. And that it's kind of just a means to make the agent look more lifelike by doing these saccadic motions. And then for these more overt gaze shifts, we tried to just follow the velocity profiles that the literature had found. And they had done all kinds of studies where people are sitting on a headrest and you have to look at the same target like 1,000 times, and they're seeing exactly what does the velocity profile look like. And we were trying to replicate that as much as possible.
How do you combine the first and the second project? So the tasks you had in the first project were not situated in terms of like the content, so it was more abstract things. So there's a bit more of thinking or having longer floors, versus in the second one, it is situated in terms of like the things that are being referred to, but there could still be longer interactions where you're explaining something and you're doing aversion, or you're thinking, what's the next thing that I want, or something.
Yep.
And related question of when you're doing gaze aversion, actually, there's always stuff in the environment, right? It's never empty space, and saliency of things might come into place of where you're looking, and if suddenly something moves, you're going to look at it. So that environmental factor of where you look
definitely
was playing to that first project.
Definitely. So I presented the project a little out of order from how I actually did them. So the first project, there's actually an earlier project that I cut, and that was kind of just how do you make gaze motions in general. It's like the least situated. And then I kind of, throughout the PhD, I was increasing the situatedness. So the collaborative kind of gazing over the targets, that was like the most situated I got. The gaze aversions that were just kind of speaking was a low one. I then did the Towers of Hanoi one, where it was kind of situated on, it was just kind of like one simple task object. And then I was kind of latching onto more task objects. So I was kind of trying to build things up that way as I was doing it, just kind of purely practically. But then at the end, I had exactly this question of, and I had all these grand plans of like, okay, at the end of the day, I'm going to combine all of these into one all-knowing, all-seeing gaze model that can do versions and coordination and personality expression. And I just didn't quite get to it, it was very difficult because you would have to have kind of a higher level controller that can know when you can accomplish kind of two goals with one motion. Because a lot of time when I'm, like you said, I'm averting my gaze from you, but it's because there's something in the task environment to look at. So I'm not only accomplishing, not creeping you out by staring at you, I'm also driving your attention to that object. I'm holding the floor by looking at it and not looking at you. So you kind of can accomplish multiple things with like this very simple channel of your gaze motion. And so trying to combine those and coordinate them was something that I still want to do, but I don't have the right answer yet. I kind of just had to do each piece by itself.
Yeah, and especially in the task setting, it seemed like the robot mostly learned to kind of replicate statistics that you got from the user data. Right? But it had no model of why it was doing that. Right? Could you imagine it's either some reinforcement learning or some modeling technique where this behavior is generated just because it is useful for the task? Like humans look at objects because of four-wheel vision, or I'm looking at an object because it seems to help the other person to locate it and things like that.
Right.
So more like a task-driven, where you have maybe even some cost function the robot is optimizing.
Absolutely. So. Yep. And that's also the direction I'm trying to kind of put this in, because I am very kind of, like you said, I'm replicating the things that I saw in the data collection. So it's very much kind of static, and it's not very robust then. It's kind of brittle. Like if I try to do anything outside of that sandwich task, the collaborative one, things kind of start to break down in weird ways. So making it, a much more robust kind of machine learned, having a cost function, like you said, is I think the way I want to go with it. And that might help with the combining things. You're right. if it can know that this variable is affected by these, these two different motions, and it can then select the right gaze motion based on its goals and based on that cost function.
I think this might be not quite what you're interested in, because it seems like a lot of your research is sort of how to make gaze seem more human.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering, do you ever look at robots that actually use their eyes as eyes, have a camera there instead of just a screen or whatever, and try to use that for the interaction as well, and how does that affect these things?
Right. And that's very interesting. So like the Mecha robot, for example, it has cameras in its eyes, and it can use those cameras to actually collect, visual information. But what I found is when I want to do things that are expressive and that actually kind of look human-like or actually convey the social signals that people do, we whip our eyes around so fast that it makes that kind of data almost useless without, I don't know, a lot of complicated things that I don't know how to do. So to me, for robots, it kind of makes sense to not limit yourself in that way, to not force robots to do sensing the way people do. So but still be able to be understandable. So using the eyes much more as a signal, and when you need actual visual input, using the camera that's on its chest or that's on the top of its head or something. Because I feel like if you're trying to do both, that's very interesting, and you actually might be able to learn just by virtue of how people evolved. It might actually do things the way people do just to make that visual processing more useful to it. But to me, I've been focusing more on the signaling side and letting other sensors do the sensing and letting the eyes kind of just be expressive and reactive. But it is an interesting question, yeah.
So it looked like in your experiments, you had an awful lot of maybe grad students and undergrads as test subjects. If you took the information that you got from those experiments and tried to implement that sort of gaze behavior in a very different population or very different culture, how would you expect your outcomes to change?
Mm-hmm. So there's a few components to that. So, it is very heavily focused on undergrad and grad student populations because these are studies run at the university. But we did try to draw from the more general community. So I feel like for similar tasks in a similar culture, I feel like things would probably, I can't say for sure, but I think things would generalize fairly well. When you think about culture, I think things would probably not generalize. I think I've done in other work, I was looking across cultures at some elements of speech and how those vary between like Western culture and Arabic culture and Eastern culture. And so there's some very different things about how we say things and how we use persuasion techniques. And I think it'd be even more so for gaze. And I've looked at some papers on, the amount of eye contact people make cross-culturally and the amount of gaze aversion people make cross-culturally is very different. So I think you would need to model that, or you need to actually know kind of which cultural context you're setting in. And then more importantly to me, I think, is kind of generalizing not just across populations, but across tasks. So trying to use, gaze aversions more generally in all kinds of different tasks that aren't the conversations that we had here. I think would need a lot more robustifying and a lot more kind of sophisticated modeling. But yeah, so there's culture definitely, and across tasks definitely.
All right, let's thank Sean again.